Hello, everyone. Hi, this is wonderful to see so many people. Thank you for joining the session. I'm just delighted to be able to address you. I see a lot of familiar names, so I'm happy to be in conversation with you. And a big thanks for inviting me to the pre-conference publishing summit. I know this is a first, and I'm excited about it. So, I'd like to make this, I'll talk for a couple of minutes and then, have you ask questions. But I was recently asked what prompted me to write my book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And the answer was really simple for me because in 30 years of doing this work, whenever I presented DEI, global DEI clearly got the most interest and was the most frustrating to global leaders. So when I rewired from my full-time job in January of 2020 and COVID hit, I decided to hunker down and write about my lived experiences. And the intent really was to give back what I'd acquired from this work to those of you who do the difficult work of inclusion culture transformation. So, this book is an act of reflection, it's an act of closure, and it's an act of giving back. And I was also prompted by the fact that, DEI progress has been painfully slow, as we know, even though CEOs have made commitments and performative statements after the murder of George Floyd. So the question is, how do we go from sort of situational actions to sustainable DEI progress, especially globally? And in my years doing DEI work, I know that I yearned for a practical global book. So this book is not an academic book. It's not a theoretical book. It's a view from the trenches of someone who's had to pioneer a way forward without any real map. And so in the time we have together, and I see a lot more people joining, so welcome, welcome. I plan to share some highlights from my book. And in doing this work, I discovered these 5 principles that form a through line for sustainable culture change, and I'm going to share those with you. But a little bit about myself before I delve into the content of my book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I grew up in India, and growing up in India, almost everyone looked like me. I belonged to the majority religion, Hinduism, and surrounded by others like me, I had the privilege of not having to think about my identity. So that was before I flew to North America. And in my own naive way, I saw myself as a center of the world, as a citizen of the world. But with that move, my identity shifted from being a person who saw herself at the center of her world to being a minority, to being an immigrant, and to being a foreigner. And I was completely unprepared for that. So this change to being identified as a minority made me realize the privileges that come from being part of the majority. I was part of the majority growing up in India, and I hadn't recognized or reflected on my privilege in that way. And more importantly, I was unable to until I was perceived as a minority and I experienced things differently. So DI is very personal for me, as I know it is to every one of you who's at this conference and on this call. So fast forward, I was part of the senior leadership team at Sodexo, a French global food and facilities management company with over 460,000 employees in over 80 countries. And I joined Sodexo at a very turbulent time when they were facing a promotion discrimination class action lawsuit in the United States filed by the African American employees that predated me. I got a lot of help from a lot of people, including Mary Frances Winters, who's on this call, and has written her books. I'm sure you're going to hear about that as well. So the journey that we charted at Sodexo from what I call class action to best in class taught me an incredible amount. And through the 18 years working there, I discovered that there are these 5 principles that anchor global DEI transformation work, and if attended to, can move an organization from isolated actions to sustainable progress. And through my work with multiple organizations, I also learned that there is an effective way to approach DI work. And there are several different ways of approaching the work, of approaching DI transformation work. So let me just share those with you. The first is what I call a universal approach, which rolls down a top-down centralized policy. And although universal approaches save time and save money, by using these commonly developed tools and are cost effective, right? Organizations can struggle to get their initiatives embedded locally because frequently this approach is very, very US centric. From the US headquarters, roll it down. Let me share an example of that with you from a global food and delivery company that encountered pushback when the company headquarters in the United States, decided to roll out an LGBTQ pride rainbow badge to display in support of their LGBTQ staff for Gay Pride Month. They had the best of intentions, right? They wanted to make allies visible and to create safety zones for their employees who were not open at work. But their employees in Egypt balked because same-sex marriages and relationships actually are illegal there. So the LGBTQ employees had learned to be discreet for their safety, and no one wanted to carry the burden of a visible label that might endanger them. So with the best of intentions, this universal top-down approach, backfired. The second approach is what I call a local approach that's designed in country and tailored to a very specific context. And the example that I have is from Ahold Delhaize, which is a Dutch company with supermarkets that have very local brand recognition. So in the United States, it's Giant, Stop and Shop, and Food Lion, for example. And the shops hire people who live in a 5-mile radius. And the idea is that if the staff reflect the community, the shop would cater better to their customers. And this type of approach is very appealing, but implementation can be inconsistent without a broader accountability measure in place. But if it's not part of an overall global strategy, it may not benefit from cross-border exchanges and best practice sharing. So I found a transversal approach to be the most suited to implementing a global change strategy. And that's what I share in the book. And a transversal approach is one where there's a global framework that shapes and guides the work, but the implementation is very local. So there's flexibility and autonomy to adapt locally. And so really takes into consideration the local environment. So, but the question still remains, how do we make our global DI efforts sustainable? And given the complex and dynamic nature of the work, global DI work, there's no checklist, there's no playbook, best practices are not enough. But through my work, I have recognized some principles that provide a through line. And each principle is a very simple statement. It's simple, yet it's very disruptive. And they don't provide standards or plug and play templates based on what's worked in one part of the world, in the United States, for example. In fact, that's really been the foundational mistake, to replicate what's worked in one part of the world. But there are these principles, 5 principles, that can be applied with sensitivity to any culture and empowers global leaders to develop their own solutions organically and not mimic any one experience. And those are the principles that I share. So I'm going to share some of them with you, but through some examples. So the first principle is make it local. And global change really has to be anchored in an understanding of the local context. It has to be rooted in local particulars and informed by the history. And understanding the context is really the first step in finding strategies to advance underrepresented groups locally. But, honestly, making it local does not mean accepting inequities. That sometimes, folks think making it local means that, you just have to go with what exists, the power dynamics and inequities. That's not the case, because outside influence can be catalysts for change. They can raise issues that those in a culture may not be able to see or to raise because they're charged or because of power dynamics. So let me share an example from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was ranked 146 out of 153 countries in the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Report. And Saudi women were considered legal minors. They had to have a male guardian to travel and to work, etc. There was an expat leader from an organization who moved to Saudi with his company, and he noticed things opening up, and he made a move to hire more Saudi women. There was no lack of qualified women in Saudi Arabia. They were very eager to advance their careers, high literacy rate. So according to Sharia law in Saudi Arabia, they had to work in a separate room with the door closed. They were not to be seen by male colleagues, and they had to communicate via an intercom. Can you folks hear me? I now have someone cutting a tree outside my window, but can you hear me? Just give me a quick thumbs up if you can hear me. Are we okay? Okay, thanks. So, they couldn't, men couldn't enter the space where they were working without, announcing themselves. And if the women were to go to a work meeting, they had to have a male chaperone. Now, viewed through a Western feminist lens, these working conditions would have been absolutely unacceptable. And outsiders using a universal approach, top-down approach, might be tempted to insist that the women integrate fully into the workplace. But by setting that ultimatum, it would be counterproductive because women wouldn't be able to work at all. But this particular leader understood the context and used his status to really push for change, disrupting the status quo from within and taking care not to impose his own views. And soon it became clear that the women needed to meet with their male colleagues in order to get their work done and advance their careers. But the conservative men really pushed back. And they felt that it was not acceptable for women to have work meetings with men without a Saudi or Muslim man to accompany them. So the country head put the dilemma back on these men, saying you can accompany them to every single meeting or you can find a solution. And these conservative men proposed that the women could meet with the men so long as they sat in an office with the door open and they sat at opposite ends of the desk. Now, a simple solution, but this leader's approach disrupted the status quo. He understood the context. He had the freedom to push for increased hiring of women. Then he invited the insiders, those with local knowledge, and even those that were most resistant to propose some changes. And he did this within the local context. So that's that first principle. I'm going to talk about one more principle, and then I'll open it up to questions. So the second principle is leaders change to lead change. And inclusive leadership, as we know, is absolutely fundamental to sustain DEI transformation. And to sustain DEI and move it from isolated actions to sustainable progress, leaders really need to lead DEI as they would any other business priority. And to do that, they need to internalize the benefit of DEI, which sometimes requires a disruption of their worldview, because disruptions expose us to our biases and to our privilege and give us the opportunity to address them. And it takes courage to do that. So in my book, I share many stories of leaders and how to influence leaders and leaders who have led with purpose and passion, but needed a disruptive experience to get there. So let me share one with you. I worked with a European leader who was very resistant to DEI, and I knew that he wanted to network with other CEOs. So I got him involved in a cross-company mentoring program in his company, in his country rather. He was assigned a woman executive, and over time they developed a very trusting relationship. She shared stories with him about being the only woman on the executive team, of being talked over, of being marginalized, of being diminished. Then she got laid off. And she told him about how she had been let go. And he came to me after that session with her and he said, it's unbelievable. This is still happening today. And he told me, he said, I don't want this happening on my watch in my organization. So this leader was curious and genuinely open to listening to his mentee's experience. He was initially resistant, but he did have the courage to move outside of his own frame of reference and his comfort zone and allow his mentee to influence his worldview. But knowing that curiosity and that courage were not enough, he made a commitment for all 12 of his direct reports to mentor a woman from a different part of the company. And I can tell you that kind of commitment had a ripple effect. Of the 12 women who were mentored through this initiative, 9 of them went on to become senior executives in the company. Why? It wasn't because they weren't capable before, but now they had the sponsorship of senior leaders, of allies, who made them visible to the organization and advised them on their career trajectory and sought out development opportunities for them. So, these disruptive experiences can do 2 things. They can, first of all, take us out of the center of the story so that we listen to other stories and we cultivate our empathy, because transformative leadership comes from that place of empathy. policy. And the other thing it can do is to expose us to our own biases and give us the opportunity to correct them. And it takes courage to do that. So leaders who are curious, who are courageous, and who are committed will take the organization from performative DI actions to sustainable progress. But they have to have that purpose and passion. They have to lead DI like they would any other business priority. I think we may have time for just one quick one more. So this one is the third principle that I talk about is that's critical to sustain DI efforts globally and anywhere in any organization is what I call and it's good business too. And without a compelling reason for change, 70% of change efforts will fail. If DI is just a reaction to external events, it can't be sustained.
Rohini, excuse me for a moment, but your audio is going in and out a little bit, so maybe if you could stay a little bit closer. I just wanted to let you know that.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay. Is this better, Mary Frances? Okay. So this is, it's good business too, which is the third principle. And, what I share there is that, DI cannot be siloed or bolted on. It has to be congruent with the organization's purpose and its business. And without a compelling reason for change, 70% of change efforts fail. If it's a reaction to external efforts, it's not going to be sustained. So quick example that I have is from Natura and Company. Natura is a Brazilian cosmetics group that includes Avon and The Body Shop. They have presence in 73 countries. And they launched an initiative called Coragen. And the purpose was to spark innovation in their products. So to do that, they wanted to hire a diverse group of interns. And they knew that if they kept the conventional requirements that interns have an elite university education, that they speak English and have international experience, they would get very few Afro-Brazilians. And Afro-Brazilians make up more than 50% of the Brazilian population. And, educational disparities fall along color lines as they in Brazil. So instead, their criteria that they used valued life experiences and an entrepreneurial mindset because they believed that they needed that diversity and that would yield that innovation. And they went to the favelas, the low-income settlements in Rio and the suburbs to get candidates. And they actually got, this is pretty amazing, 22,000 candidates for just 20 slots. And the recruitment process, they basically tested them just on two things, creativity and teamwork. And ultimately, they hired 20 interns, and these, about 85% of them were Afro-Brazilian. They generated 4 ideas, 3 of them which became a part now of their product line, of their business strategy. So really, this particular principle that I talk about, and it's good business too. So we've covered make it local, leaders lead change, and it's good business too. Really says that DI cannot happen in a vacuum. You have to develop a change narrative of how DI can benefit the business or mission of the organization, embed it in the core business strategy, align it with your values, make it part of the scaffolding of your organization. And when it's embedded in the core business, it's likely to be sustained. So if it's a reaction, a check the box, it's going to be performative. And making it part of the scaffolding of the organization means embedding it in the internal and external ecosystem, because organizations are comprised of these interconnected systems. So it has to be embedded in all of the systems. And that's the 4th principle that I talk about. Go deep, wide, and inside out, which is absolutely critical to make the work sustainable. And, there's several examples, but the one that I share is from Spectrum TV Charter Communications of how they integrated their disability strategy to really enhance their customer experience. And the last principle is know what matters and count it. And we really have to treat DEI as we would any other business priority, setting goals, establishing behaviors, measuring progress, fostering accountability. We've got to hold leaders accountable. And we've heard the old adage which says what gets measured gets done. And DI is really no different than any other business priorities, a priority that's measured and tracked. And it's most effective when it's aligned with the local context and leaders are held accountable. And in the book, I have a lot of different metrics that you can use both lead and lag indicators. The lag indicators are those representation outcomes, and the lead indicators are the behaviors and actions that you need in order to, if done consistently, will get you to those lag indicators, those numeric outcomes. So I'm just going to close here and then open it up for questions, because when we start talking about systems change, it's very easy to forget that every one of us has the power as individuals, no matter where we are in the organization's hierarchy. Because as I say, change happens at the intersection of people and processes. And for sustainable organizational change, we need to implement those 5 principles. They're not sequential, they're not linear, they're interconnected, but we really need to attend to all 5 of the principles, make it local. Leaders lead to lead change, and it's good business too. Go deep, wide, and inside out, and know what matters and count it. And it also means that each of us can work to achieve those goals. We don't have to wait for these seismic shifts to happen within the organization. We need to step into that power as individuals. For sustainable DEI, we need DEI champions and allies throughout the organization. And look, we all know that DEI may seem like nice, soft words, but we know that the journey there is tough. And every single person who embarks on that is changed somehow. And if you're not changing, if you're not growing, if you're not seeing things differently and in new ways, you're really not on that journey. Because diversity, equity, and inclusion can be profoundly personal. It can be profoundly structural, and it is profoundly disruptive. And to get there, we need to know ourselves. We need to listen to each other and be willing to step out with humility and with conviction into a realm that often has more questions than answers, especially in today's day and age where there's so many competing priorities, when we have external events, when we have disruptors like AI, when we have the SCOTUS ruling on affirmative action in higher education and the trickle-down effect in organizations. So we really are at an inflection point, and I'm very hopeful about this next DI chapter because of all of you that are on this call and beyond, and the many allies that we have engaged in this process. So yeah, I've shared information about my book, and I look forward to questions from you. If you have questions, please put it in the chat or raise your hand, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Questions? I was told to leave some time for questions, so I'm hoping that someone is going to have a question here. Did it make sense? What I shared with you, is that something that it would be useful to your work? The 5 principles that I shared in terms of making global DI work sustainable. And clearly, these are examples that I shared were from different parts of the world. I shared an example from Saudi, from Europe, and from Brazil.
Rohini, I have a question. If no one else has a question,
Thank you.
Are you seeing more interest and activity around DEI outside of the United States over the past couple of years than before? I think I've noticed that more more organizations and more activity around DEI outside of the United States.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot more activity with DEI outside the United States. And the reason for that, Mary Frances, is a couple of things. First of all, I'm seeing a lot of activity from global companies in the US who are realizing that they cannot have this top-down approach. They can't have, DEI be US centered and just take that model and replicate it in different parts of the world. And I actually share a lot of stories in my book about my own journey, about where I made mistakes, where I tripped up, and the lessons that I learned, because I think those lessons would be useful for those doing global work. So I'm seeing that. So they're actually saying, well, can we move away and do something that's not US centered? I'm also seeing a lot of work outside of the United States. Now, for instance, this morning I had 2 calls. Both the calls were from APAC. And these are companies that are expanding in the West, in the global West. So they want to basically say, lean into how do we do this work in parts of the world that they see it have been doing it for many more years. So it's both and. It's global companies looking at things differently. It's organizations outside of the United States who are now saying we have ambition to expand globally, and how do we do this work? And the third part of it is that it's organizations that are actually saying that, diversity is a US export. We don't want that. We want our own way of looking at it. And a lot of companies, particularly in Europe, actually leading with equality and equity versus diversity and inclusion, because they see diversity and inclusion, diversity as very US, centered in the United States history with race, that they cannot relate to in the same way. And they see inclusion as a very soft term. So for them, equity and equality certainly have more teeth to it. And honestly, in some parts of Europe, they have, hate speech laws that would make us cringe in this country sometimes. They're so strict because, so there's a lot that we can learn from different parts of the world as well. So they want something that's their version of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thanks for that question, Mary Frances. Great question. Oh. Anyone else? I see something in the chat, but okay, it just says any other questions that folks have. I mean, I will say that there are a couple of chapters in the book, Mary Frances and others, on race. And I think, this topic is very charged. It's politically and emotionally charged everywhere in the world. And race shows up very differently depending on where we are, what part of the world, because I think race and racism are very universal, but they're also very particular and very specific and very contextual. And if we approach, in the United States, because of our history, we have a way of approaching race. And if we use that same lens to approach race in other parts of the world, we can miss entry points like discrimination against religious minorities or caste or ethnic minorities in Kenya, for example. So I think we've got to really look at it, in a very nuanced way and address issues of race and racism, which are universal. Colorism is universal, which shows up differently. And unless we understand the context, we're not going to be able to address it. So thank you for that. And I'm getting messages saying time's up, time's up. But I hope that you will pick up a copy of the book. If you have questions, please reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I hope that this brief overview of some of the principles in my book and why I wrote it was useful to you. So thank you all, and see you. Bye-bye.